have a little bit of a tighter agenda than we originally envisioned because there's 3 ministers from Queen's Park here, Brad Duguid, Minister Sandals, and I think Minister Del Duca. I haven't seen him yet, but I'm sure he's on his way. So I don't think Minister Duguid needs any introduction, but just so you know, he has a lot of political experience in terms of being a councillor and chair of public works at the City of Toronto, and quite a number of years at Queen's Park in various ministerial roles, but most importantly to our group today is Minister of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure. So without any further ado, Brad, could you come up and say a few words, please?
Well, thank you, Andy, in particular for including Liz and I in your segmented introductions of everybody here. We were having trouble trying to figure out where we fit in, and now we know we're completely excluded from everyone else. But thanks for calling us political decision makers. Liz, that's the nicest thing anybody ever said about us. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to thank Sean and Andy. Thank you and your respective organizations, everybody here from the construction sector, whether you're from the worker side and worker representative side, or whether you're from the industry side. And Jan De Silva, thank you for being here from the Toronto Regional Board of Trade. It is so good working with you on these issues. And Paul, thank you and your organization for delivering what I think is a very timely and important message. Liz and I and Steve, who will be here later on, have to take a lot of heat sometimes for the decisions that we make to invest revenue in infrastructure. Politicians can promise to build infrastructure. They can say they support infrastructure, and every politician I've ever met says that. The difference I think that we have to continually make is between those who are willing to take the challenging decisions to create the revenues needed to make those investments and those that aren't. We're a government with a premier who's willing to make those tough decisions. And the Hydro One decision, the $4 billion that we're going to take from that and put into building infrastructure across this province is one of those decisions that, frankly, I'm very proud as a public representative to be able to make and talk about. And I know it's not easy out there. It's one of those decisions that I suspect is very difficult in a 30-second clip to explain to the public. It's not something that's going to make us more popular, but I can tell you, building the infrastructure, building the transit, building the roads and bridges, building the core infrastructure that this province needs is something that the people of Ontario, I believe, are going to understand and appreciate. And you can't have one without the other. You can't have the investments if you don't come up with ways to raise the revenues to make those investments. So the report that you're coming forward with today gives us an incredible opportunity to continue to educate Ontarians about the importance of these investments. When you think about it, and Paul, you can correct me if I'm using the wrong math, but I think that you said for every $1 billion we invest in infrastructure, we create 85,000 person years of employment. That is astounding. Now, when you think about the $4 billion that we're investing in infrastructure, just from the Hydro One initiative alone, $4 billion we wouldn't otherwise be able to invest. You can do the math for me, but I think that's 340,000 person years of work that's being created by that decision. If that's not justification for taking some of those tough decisions, Paul, I don't know what is. So you can correct my math if you like, but it's certainly good news. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your support of our efforts to make those tough decisions, and thank you for the incredible work that you do to build this province up. Thank you all so very much, and have a fantastic day today.
Without any further ado, I'd like to call up the Honourable Liz Sandals, the Minister of Education and the MPP for Guelph, who's going to talk probably about community hubs and that sort of infrastructure as well.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here with so many different people from the residential and ICI construction sector, and you're probably wondering, what on earth is the Minister of Education doing here? I'm actually one of the eyes in the ICI. That's why I'm here. And I'm here because, although nobody ever thinks of it that way, I have all the school boards in the province consolidated on my books. That actually makes me the single biggest landholder in the public sector, or building holder, because I actually have an awful lot of schools. So that's what I'm here to tell you about, is education and infrastructure from a bit of a different point of view from the one that you usually think about. So when we think about schools, if we think about this from an infrastructure perspective, I actually have 4,900 publicly funded schools on my books. These schools represent 280 million square feet, or 2.2 million pupil places. Building and maintaining these schools requires a significant ongoing provincial investment, the return of which, unlike everything else you're doing here today, where you're looking at infrastructure in terms of return on investment, in terms of economic productivity, we actually have all that infrastructure, and we look at it from a totally different point of view, which is not overall economic prosperity, but looking at education and the influence of education on the future productivity of our province. So we're not looking, when we make infrastructure investments, on will the infrastructure directly affect economic productivity. We're looking at, will a better learning space allow us to provide better education to more students, and it's education that will be contributing to productivity. But having said that, we look at infrastructure through a different lens than everybody else, that doesn't mean that we're not a big player. We actually are a huge player in infrastructure investment, and have been ever since 2003. That's why we have actually invested about $13.4 billion in school infrastructure since 2003. And the expert on what does that generate from your measure will leave over here. But from my point of view, that's resulted in nearly 755 new schools and more than 720 major additions and renovations, total renovations of schools, all over Ontario, not just in growth communities, but all over Ontario, so that our infrastructure investments are probably more geographically spread than in many other ministries. We've actually just this year, recently in the last month, announced another $498 million. So another $500 million has been announced in the last month. Bet you never noticed, because you don't think about schools. But I've actually announced $500 million worth of infrastructure spending in November. 30 more new schools, 26 major additions and renovations, again, all across the province. Our investment also includes so in addition to that, $1.25 billion over 3 years for school condition improvement, because like many other public sector infrastructure holders, we have a problem with a backlog in terms of maintenance and repair. So we're investing $1.25 billion in maintenance and repair over 3 years. Again, that doesn't affect people who are doing construction in terms of huge projects, but it actually affects people who do construction in small businesses, and again, all over the province. Last spring, we announced another major investment in building up our licensed childcare capacity. So we're spending $120 million over 3 years to add about 4,000 new licensed child care spaces to the system. But again, that's 164 new child care rooms, which is 164 construction projects coming out of that $120 million for new child care. So once again, our measure on economic productivity is that that allows more families, more women in particular, to go to work and be economically productive. But from your point of view, that creates a lot of small construction projects, and they're spread all over the province. So to let you know where we're going to continue this investment. So over the next 10 years, when we talk about the $130 million infrastructure commitment, 11 billion of that infrastructure investment will actually be going into schools. And that will generate economic activity all over the province. And again, from my point of view, more importantly, it will create better spaces to learn. So not only are we creating jobs right now, we are creating a better educated workforce for the future. And that too contributes to our economic prosperity. So there's a bit of a different take. I'll leave Steve and Brad, who are the real economic development infrastructure construction experts, but that gives you a little bit of a different twist on a lot of money that flows into construction, but from a quite different perspective than your usual perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Sandals. That was a wonderful perspective on the social infrastructure that we obviously all need. And thank you to Minister Duguid, who has to go back to Queen's Park. Okay, bye-bye. Minister of Transportation, Stephen Del Duca, has just arrived. And I don't think people need too much of an introduction with him. But there's something you probably don't know, is that Minister Del Duca, for a period of a few years, was on the RCCO Board of Directors and had a very poor attendance record. However, he was always responding via email in terms of decisions we were making, reports that we were commissioning. And I don't think RCCO has any more influence because he used to be on the board, because I would say that Minister Del Duca is one of those people that looks at evidence very carefully before making a decision. He's a very pragmatic and thoughtful decision maker. One of the things that RCCO has been advocating for quite some time are things like mobility, pricing, and hot lanes. And I just wanted to make a quick plug that Marty Collier is here from Transport Futures, and he will be hosting, there he is, put up your hand. Talk to Marty sometime later. January 22nd, he's hosting an event on hot lanes, and it's, what's the subtitle? Cooling congestion, one lane at a time. And I think his wife came up with that one. It's a very creative title. Anyway, we've heard from Minister Del Duca over the last few months saying that his ministry staff have been looking at hot lanes, and we'll likely hear some sort of announcement in the coming weeks. So we're looking forward to that and testing the pilot project, so to speak. But obviously there's many other issues that the minister is involved with in terms of highway infrastructure. He's responsible for metro links, road safety, and there's been a lot of great initiatives with respect to tow trucks and those sorts of issues. So, oh, the Mayor of Barrie just arrived. Minister Del Duca.
Well, good morning, everyone. I didn't realize Richard Lyle was sitting right in the front row. That's not right. I don't know how that happened, Richard. I'm really thrilled to have the chance to be here with all of you today. I gotta say about Andy's introduction, you know, like the standard thing that's in these speeches at every event I do is, Thank you very much, whoever the introducer is. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. But of course, Andy revealed something about my historical attendance rates at RCCA. I thought those records were sealed, Andy. I didn't know that. Just don't tweet about it at any point during the course of my remarks today. I'd also like to think that it wasn't just in terms of my interventions and the input that I provided, that perhaps it was also about quality, not just quantity as well. But I was really honored to have the chance to serve. This is before I became an MPP, when I was working as the Director of Public Affairs for the Carpenters District Council of Ontario, where I was for 4 or 5 years, and it really was an honor to be involved with Andy and with Richard and with everyone else involved. Phil, I know there's other people in the room today who are involved with the RCCAO, and it was an honor to have that opportunity to learn, because what I will say, whether we're talking about the RCCAO or the Ontario Construction Secretariat, what's great about the work that you've historically undertaken and you continue to do is that you're always pushing, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. You're always pushing those of us who are in elected office, and to make sure that we keep moving forward with decisions that make sense, particularly in this area of infrastructure. I'm really thrilled that Liz Sandals is here. I'm sorry, Liz, I didn't have the chance to hear most of your remarks because I was stuck in a little bit of traffic. I wish I knew somebody who could fix. That's a joke. You're supposed to laugh when I say that. You're not supposed to take that one so seriously. I normally get upset when people tell me that they're stuck in traffic. I take it a little bit personally. We're past the 12-month mark in terms of how long I've served as minister, so my staff tell me I'm not allowed to use the excuse that I'm still new and that we're still working on it. So I just wanted to say, Liz, what I did hear at the tail end, great remarks, and Liz is someone who I was very proud to stand beside in Guelph just a few days ago, as we talked about the application window being opened for the brand new standalone Connecting Links Fund, which will support communities like Guelph and the other 76 communities that have Connecting Links in them. So Liz, it's great to see you here this morning, and I know that you've heard from Minister Duguid as well. I think it's great that you were able to have the three of us here today. And I think that that's a really strong indication of exactly how committed the Ontario Liberal government is to making sure that across all of the different sectors, for quality of life reasons, but also for reasons of making sure that we continue to have a strong and growing economy, that we get this right. I actually have a written speech up here on the podium. I got to tell you, though, I look out across the room and I see so many friends and familiar faces. I think I'm going to discard, or I'm not going to use. Don't get mad at me, Patrick. Patrick from my office is at the back of the room. He's probably going to get mad at me for saying this. I'm not sure that I'm going to stick to the script itself, because there's a few things that I want to share with you, I guess, and then I understand from Andy that we're going to be opening it up and taking some questions, which I have to tell you, I hope the questions are very hard-hitting. It'll be a great warm-up for what's coming at 10:30 in question period, right, Liz? So feel free to roast me as much as you'd like. I also do want to say thank you as well to the Canadian Centre for Economic Affairs for its research and for the work that it also does, and to all of the other individuals. I see, of course, Jan and others in this room representing so many different organizations that collectively work so hard to make sure that we get it right. And I know Andy mentioned Martin Collier is in the room. I was very happy to be at the future of the transport futures, discussing the future of the car. I think it was not that many weeks ago. So it's great, again, to see all of you and to have this chance. I was thinking a little bit about what I might say this morning, both last night and on the drive down from my community this morning, and it actually got me to thinking a little bit about those first few days after getting the call from Premier Wynne saying, okay, Del Duca, we're putting you in transportation, and it was a bit of an awesome feeling for many reasons, not least of which because for my entire life, I have lived here in the GTHA. And like all of you, like many of you, certainly seen the explosive population growth and seen the fact that we have right across this region a significant challenge with respect to gridlock. So understanding that this was now something that I would have at least partial responsibility for fixing, working with all of you, working with Liz and the rest of our government, it was a bit of an overwhelming few moments to stop and think about what needed to be done and what we would be able to get done, given the mandate that we had just been given by the people of Ontario. And then I can remember a few days later, when I was still very new in the job, and still getting briefed on exactly what would be required and what we should do, and really nowhere near formulating in my own head exactly what the best way forward was on a wide variety of issues. I remember my staff setting up the opportunity for me to sit down with some of the reporters, some of the journalists who cover these issues here in the GTA. And that was also a little bit daunting because I was so new, you know, and it's funny because I can still very vividly remember the conversations, the interviews that I had with those reporters. These are all seasoned journalists covering these topics for most of their careers and doing a fantastic job of covering these issues, and they still do cover these issues. And I can remember sitting in my boardroom at MTO and questions flying at me fast and furious. Do you support this kind of project or that kind of project? This kind of technology or that kind of technology? Do you think we should spend more in the GTHA or spend elsewhere outside the GTHA? Over and over. Do you support this kind of revenue generation or that kind of revenue generation? It was really a fascinating and somewhat terrifying experience. But my message that day to those journalists is a message that I've come back to, and some of you in the room who've heard me speak before, I think will recognize it. I had a pretty simple message for them, and it's a message I do come back to on a regular basis. Again, as someone who's lived here in this region for my whole life and has seen that challenge that we continue to grapple with, talking to friends and family as well about this during the course of the election campaign back in 2014, it seemed to me that we had to move beyond that point or past that point where we were constantly struggling with analysis and debate and discussion and study and then making decisions, depending on which level of government we're talking about, all levels of government, in fact, making decisions and having all kinds of fanfare around announcements. And the decisions might change, the opinions might change, the governments might change. And so we have had in this region, I think for a very long time, a bit of a stop and start approach to how we've dealt with these issues. And I can understand the frustration. I call it a credibility deficit that I think governments, and this is not targeting provincial governments only, I think it's all three levels of government. And it's not a partisan shot. I think it's affected all of the different political parties that have had the chance to lead this province, and for the most part this country as well, going back for a number of years. The credibility deficit that exists amongst those that we represent about whether government, not a particular government, but whether government notionally, as a concept, as a group, actually had the capacity and the creativity and the determination to fix the problem and move forward. And I still believe that in that 2014 provincial election campaign and also in the recent federal election campaign, I think what people in this region and in regions outside of the GTHA, like Guelph and like the North, the Southwest, and the East, I think what they responded to in a very visceral way was this notion that there is a plan, and that the plan is to actually get on with building, to be bold about this, to put shovels in the ground, to demonstrate to people, ideally working together at all levels of government, but also with those, including many of you in this room, all of you in this room, to get those shovels in the ground and to deliver the outcomes and deliver the service that will help ease the congestion on our roads and highways, that will give people real, viable options so that they can leave their cars at home, for example, some days, all days, so that we can continue to have that economic growth and prosperity that we need. And so again, going back to those very first 2 days, my message was pretty clear. I don't want to look backwards. The people of Ontario, this is one of the lines that I'm fond of using. Andy's heard it many times before. The people of Ontario gave the Kathleen Wynne government a clear mandate to put progress ahead of politics and to deliver results instead of more rhetoric. And I believe since June of 2014, that's what we've been doing. Now here in the GTHA, and Liz, I hope you'll forgive me because I'm going to focus some of my comments on the GTHA and then I'll circle back if I have time to talk a bit more about what's happening in other parts of the province. Liz said it's okay, so I have her permission to do this. But here in the GTHA, literally since those first few months on the job, I think that we have moved forward very aggressively with a transit plan that's exciting and a transportation plan that's exciting in terms of the number of projects that have been announced, pushed out the door, and in many cases are under construction or in those final stages of planning. Now, I don't want to be up here giving you sort of a laundry list of all those projects because frankly, I do that in a lot of my speeches, and I also, for what it's worth, you can find most of those on the Metrolinx or MTO website. But what I can tell you, though, is that when you start to look forward over the next number of years, and this is something that's really, and you guys get this better than most, these kinds of projects that we're talking about, large, important, substantial infrastructure projects, particularly in the transportation realm, they're big, they're expensive, they're disruptive, and they take time. And you will probably all remember that in the 2014 provincial election campaign, when Premier Wynne and all of our candidates talked about building Ontario up, moving the province forward, investing the $134 billion over a decade across all sectors or all parts of the infrastructure spectrum, investing an additional $31.5 billion in transportation, transit, and other critical forms of infrastructure, specifically in that Moving Ontario Forward plan. We talked about it in terms of a 10-year horizon. And that's important because, again, we all do understand exactly that there is a long runway when it comes to these projects. But if you sit where we are today in this room, and you recognize that this plan for investment started about a year ago, maybe even a little bit more than a year ago, you realize that within a decade from that point in time, so in 8 or 9 years from now, sit back and think for a second what the transit map will actually look like in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and slightly beyond. Now, just a few days ago, some of you in the room might have seen, and I forget actually who tweeted the original photo or who developed the photo and put it up on Twitter, but it was a picture of the Toronto, basically the Toronto or GTA transit map for a couple of years from now. So it had the existing TTC plus the Toronto-York Spadina subway extension plus the Eglinton Crosstown on the map. And it may have had some other pieces as well. And it was fascinating for me because though my staff tell me and my wife tells me to stop doing this, every tweet that mentions my name or has my Twitter handle in it comes right to my BlackBerry. It was fascinating. That's not an invitation to start tweeting at me, by the way, if that's how you're looking to get a hold of me. But throughout the rest of that day and even into the next day, there were tons of tweets and retweets and favorites of this picture. And it was a fantastic picture, but it only tells part of the story. Because when you think out over the next 7, 8, 9 years, and you layer over that existing map what it will look like when the Finch LRT comes into service, when the Huron-Ontario LRT comes into service in Peel region, when the Hamilton LRT comes into service, and perhaps most fundamentally from a regional perspective, and I say this knowing that the Mayor of Barrie is in the room in particular, to see the 7 GO corridors, which will be transformed over the next number of years from the traditional sort of peak one-directional service to the GO Regional Express Rail Plan that we talked about in last year's campaign, transforming all 7 of our corridors and taking 5 of those 7 corridors and delivering two-way, 5 of those 7 for now, and delivering two-way all-day electrified GO service. When you layer those 7 corridors on top of what I talked about a second ago, you actually see that not that long from now, in terms of infrastructure planning, not that long from now, we will have an integrated transit and transportation network here in this region, with more work still to come. There's no doubt about that. But to look at that from my perspective, and I'm hoping that we get that map out into the public domain relatively soon, it's fascinating to know that while there is still a bit of a credibility deficit and certainly some skepticism about whether we are getting this right and will continue to get it right, the work is already happening. The work is already happening. And that means, and some in the room again will have heard me talk about the fact that I have a couple of young kids at home, 2 girls, 8 years old and 4 years old. That means that when my 8-year-old is going off to college or university or whatever she plans to do with herself when she's completed high school, she'll actually have the benefit of that integrated network across the GTHA, up to Barrie, out to Kitchener-Waterloo, to the east, to the west, something that I didn't necessarily have the benefit of. And again, I've lived here in this region my whole life, and I'm fond of telling this story about turning 16 in 1989 and getting my driver's license just a few weeks after I hit 16. And all of my friends did the same thing. And even though I took public transit coming in from Etobicoke to school downtown on a fairly regular basis, I'm pretty sure that my experience, by and large, is very similar to the experience that people right across this region have had. And so it's so important for us to make sure that as we continue to add service and put more transit projects into play over the course of the next number of years, that we're actually not that far away from delivering something pretty phenomenal. And that doesn't, I just talked about the physical, that doesn't even take into account the fare and service integration that we're also looking at. You know, by the end of next year, by the end of 2016, the Presto fare card will be completely rolled out in all of the 905, or all of our 905 municipal transit systems on GO Transit, on OC Transpo in Ottawa, and here in Toronto on the TTC. And I know that the team at Metrolinx, the team at Presto, and the TTC are making phenomenal progress here in Toronto. But imagine where we were just a few years ago, where wherever you were in the system, you had to contemplate exactly how you were going to pay for taking the transit that you wanted to take. And we're not that far away from a world in which there is that seamlessness that we are all looking to provide to people so that we can make it more convenient and more accessible and just frankly easier for them to have that chance. So I wanted to put that out there, that even though I know there continues to be concern and there continues to be skepticism, from my perspective, and this is the point that I was trying to make to media in those first few days after becoming minister, that the way to defeat the skepticism and the way to actually destroy that credibility deficit and at the same time reduce, if not eliminate, the infrastructure deficit is to get on with it, is to get those shovels in the ground, to be bold, and to build. And again, that's what our Premier is doing. You know, from my perspective as well, when we look at how we deal with transportation here in this region and beyond, we can talk about the numbers, and I know that everybody in this room kind of has a conceptual understanding of what multi-billions of dollars can deliver. But I think we also have to go a little bit beyond that in terms of how creative we are prepared to be. And Andy mentioned in the introduction, of course, that at some point, and I've said this publicly, as has the Premier, at some point between now and the end of the year, we will be providing an update with respect to HOTs. And that's interesting, and I'm sure everyone in this room will be very eager and looks forward with great anticipation. I know that Andy and Martin and so many others in this room have been calling for this for quite some time. But to me, that's one part. It's an important part, but it's one part of a larger puzzle. And my team at MTO, you know, phenomenal group. I'm not sure if many in this room know this, but in January, just in a few weeks, Ontario's Ministry of Transportation will celebrate its 100th anniversary. I mean, that's a pretty phenomenal fact when you consider how far back this ministry, and had different names if you go all the way back through that century, how much work it's done. It has, and deservedly so, an extraordinarily proud track record and legacy of helping to build the province up through that entire century. But from my perspective, we also have to start to consider, and we are within the ministry, we have to start to consider what the next wave of innovation will look like in terms of how we do our transportation planning. I think many in this room will know that not that many weeks ago, we announced that Ontario will be the first province in Canada to permit the testing of automated vehicles on our roads come January through a pilot program for those that have successfully completed the online application process to participate in this pilot. And I think that the application process went live yesterday, Dana, is that right? It went live yesterday. So there are now entities out there, universities, auto manufacturers, et cetera, who can apply to participate in this pilot and then get these vehicles, not just cars, but vehicles out on Ontario's roads and highways to test the technology here. And to me, this is, in addition to the HOT lane discussion, this is one of those other really fascinating opportunities that I believe our province has to grasp and kind of run with. Because in jurisdictions south of the border and elsewhere, there's a lot of this testing that's already taking place. And over the last few weeks, I've had the chance to talk to a variety of people in the traditional auto sector. And I think that the other thing we have to take into account is that the auto sector itself is already contemplating a world in which the very notion of car ownership is completely different from that with which I grew up, or many of us in this room grew up with. And so from my perspective as the Minister of Transportation, in addition to how we continue to invest in infrastructure projects, which is crucial, we have to look at what else can we do to innovate? What else can we do to disrupt ourselves? What else can we do to force innovation on ourselves so that we can take all of the positives of what we've learned over the last half century and fuse those together with other concepts, other ideas that might seem a little bit out there to some people at this particular juncture. But with the rapid change of disruptive innovation that's happening across so many different sectors of the economy and of society, I don't think we can afford to be tone deaf to what's happening out there. And so I look forward in the new year as we celebrate our 100th anniversary as a ministry, as we look at updating the big move, as we look at the multimodal strategy for transportation across the greater Golden Horseshoe, as we look at all of these major pieces that are out there, how can we take some of that, what might seem like a little bit outside the box radical thinking, and bring it to the discussion so that we end up in a place in a decade, in 15 years, in 20 years, when the combination of the infrastructure investments, the physical that I talked about just a few minutes ago, marries itself very well to some of the innovations that we need to embrace, I think, to produce that final outcome. And that final outcome, of course, is making sure that we have a system that flows, whether you're in Guelph or you're in Thunder Bay or you're in downtown Toronto, a transportation system that flows so that people and goods can move relatively freely, relatively accessibly and conveniently, helps the economy, helps our quality of life. So I could now, Andy, embark on the rest of the speech here if you'd like me to, but I really don't want to. What I do want to say is, if I can just finish up by saying this, for all of you in this room who have been pushing and provoking and enticing and cajoling government to sometimes make those hard decisions, I know this is not going to happen anyway, but don't stop. If there's one thing that I'll finish on, it'll be this. Premier Kathleen Wynne and Liz Sandals and Deb Matthews and Charles Sousa and Brad Duguid and the rest of our team, right across this province, representing communities, 444 municipalities. Peter Milchan's also here at the back of the room, by the way, MPP for Etobicoke Lakeshore and Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure. So Peter gets it as well. Everybody in our team gets it. Across those 444 municipalities, the needs and the asks for infrastructure investments and for infrastructure partnerships are off the charts, And that means that because we continue to play simultaneous catch up and keep up on these files, that means that we have to make hard decisions sometime. And I know this is not a partisan gathering, and I'll resist the temptation to become partisan as I close off this morning. But I will only say to all of you, it's particularly important that you continue to push and you continue to advocate, but most importantly, you continue to make sure that you don't let any politician, regardless of his or her party, off the hook when they tell you or they try to tell you that there's an easy, quick, cheap way to deal with this issue. Because you know it better than we know it. There just isn't. And so right now in the exact current political climate we find ourselves in, when a politician comes before you, whether he or she is municipal or provincial, and if it's provincial, it won't be coming from the Ontario Liberal Party, that I can assure you, or federal, and they tell you that we can get from where we are today to where we need to be in 10 years for that vision, that map that I talked about earlier, or where we need to be with respect to the roads, bridges, highways that we need beyond the GTHA, if they tell you that they can accomplish that quickly, easily, and cheaply without having to make a hard decision, they're not being honest with you. And what we need, not we as Liberals, what we need as Ontarians is for you to continue to push, to continue to hold us to account, and to not let any politician who tries to sell you that or to try to sell Ontarians off the hook. So, thank you very much for having me here this morning.